We want to make sure we greet these dear folks after the service as well. Okay, well, let us bow our heads in prayer at this time as we Lord to be with us. Dear Father in heaven, we thank you again for this joyous occasion. And now as we open your word in the few moments that we have together, that you will speak to us through your word. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, on October 6th of this year, talk show host and comedian Ellen DeGeneres and her same-sex partner were seen sitting with former President George W. Bush and his wife at a Dallas Cowboy football game and a Green Bay Packer football game in Dallas, Texas. Now, the two couples could not be more different. The former president is a born-again Christian, and that's something that he talked about when he was running for president in the year 2000 and how the Lord saved him from alcohol. He was a former Republican president, and his views on politics and foreign policy greatly differ from Ellen. One person by the name of Mark Ruffalo said, "Sorry, until George W. Bush is brought to justice for the crimes of the Iraq War, including American-led torture, Iraqi deaths and displacement, and the deep scars, emotional and otherwise, inflicted on our military that served his folly, we can't even begin to talk about kindness." Susan Sarandon tweeted, "Missing the point entirely. DeGeneres framed the issue as simply a matter of her hanging out with someone with different opinions, not a man repeatedly accused of being a war criminal." But then Elton John, who is also in a same-sex relationship, he stood up for Ellen and he said this. He admired Ellen for standing up for her friendship with the former president, and he said, "Unfortunately, what our democracy has become now is that it's not okay, not healthy." Ellen herself said, "I'm friends with George Bush. In fact, I'm friends with a lot of people who don't share the same beliefs that I have. We're all different, and I think that we've forgotten that's okay." Again. Now, this whole incident of Ellen sitting with the former president and the firestorm of tweets that went out as Christians thinking about who we do or don't associate with. And as a Christian, obviously, George Bush was being a witness by befriending this couple. But we need to ask ourselves the same question. Do we only associate with people of the same color or social status? Do we only hang out with people with the same economic status? Would we dare be friends with someone that is leading the gay lifestyle? Do we associate with people with different political views? Would we be friends with somebody that has a completely different religion, maybe Catholic, or going a step further, maybe Muslim, or maybe even more radical than that, being friends with an atheist? You know, the third time I went back to college and the second time to liberal arts school, I went to Walla Walla University, and for those of you that are new to the Adventist faith, that's one of our many Adventist colleges around the country. And it happens to be in my home state of Washington, about 2.5 hours of my hometown of Spokane. And at the time, I was working on my undergrad in history, and I was also doing an internship in my congressman's office. And somehow I became friends with a fellow student that had completely different political views, but not only that, he had different views on creation that most of us Adventists share. And I don't remember how we became friends. I think it was probably in the cafeteria. That's where most people meet and greet. And we were able to discuss things without getting at each other's throats. And that's something that you don't see today, unfortunately, with violent protests in the streets, and the social media are no longer civil anymore. And we have totally lost the example of Jesus, as he said for us as Christians, undesirable and lost. And one such incident is very important. It's found in the book of Matthew. And in this particular story, Matthew's writing about himself. And it's found in Matthew 9, if you'll turn there, verses 9 to 13. Matthew chapter 9, verses 9 through 13. Matthew chapter 9, verses 9 through 13. And it says, "And as Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting in the tax office. And he said to him, 'Follow me.' And he rose and followed him. And it happened that as he was reclining at the table in the house, behold, many tax gatherers and sinners came and were dining with Jesus and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why is your teacher eating with the tax gatherers and sinners?" But when he heard this, he said, "It is not those who are healthy who need a physician, but those who are sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire compassion, not sacrifice, for I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Now, in the time that Jesus was living in, these tax gatherers were hated people because they were Jewish people. These men were so hated, and the Pharisees were looking, of course, for a Messiah that was going to overthrow the Romans, and many of the Jewish people were as well. But another reason why these tax collectors were hated is because they would collect more than Rome even required, and they would pocket the difference. And that's why they became very, very wealthy. And Matthew was one of them. Of course, you have the story of Zacchaeus in the Bible as well. And he was also taking more than he was supposed to. And he also gave his heart to the Lord. But Matthew, I'm sure was no different. And Jesus, however, sees something different in Matthew. And so he calls him to be a disciple. Now we might wonder, why would Jesus call such a lowlife when he knew Matthew's profession? Well, he knew the heart of Matthew. And he knew that Matthew had been listening to his teachings. And in fact, the Desire of Ages says, and it's just one little sentence, she says, "The publicans were less bigoted and self-sufficient, and thus were more open to the influence of truth." And Jesus knew this as well. And after Matthew is called to be a disciple, as we just read here, he calls a big feast at his home. He has all of his friends gather in there, and Jesus joined them. And he knew the firestorm that it would create with the Pharisees, who were the religious leaders of the day, but it didn't matter to Jesus because he knew the benefit of being a witness and drawing. He was accused by the Pharisees of being a glutton and a wine bibber, but the ironic thing was they were what they were calling Jesus. The Pharisees would only associate with those that were of the same social standard, that being well educated in the law, but because they were working for Rome and they stole money from the people, the Pharisees would not associate with them, but the Pharisees also stole money from the people. In Deuteronomy 26:12, it talks about the law of Moses, and one particular law stated that the spiritual leaders were to take care of the widows and their needs, but the opposite was happening. Jesus had this to say in Matthew 23. We're still in Matthew, so just go to Matthew 23. Matthew 23, verse 14. And he is talking to the Pharisees. And he has some very strong words for them. He says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you devour widows' houses, even while for a pretense you make long prayers. Therefore you shall receive great condemnation." Now the Pharisees expected even the poor widows to give all they had to do what they said was the Lord's work. And what would happen is, if a lady's husband died, he had much land and wealth, the Pharisees would go to that woman and say, "You need to give that over to us for the temple service," but then they would keep it for themselves. And so they, in fact, were crooks. And Jesus points that out in this particular text. Many times, James addresses this issue of partiality. In James chapter 2, and that's a little book in the New Testament, towards the end of the New Testament, right after the book of Hebrews, James chapter 2, and we're going to look at verses 1 and who we are associating or who we may not be associating with. And this is the sin of being partial to one side or the other. In James 2, starting with verse 1, he says, "My brethren, do not hold your faith in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ with an attitude of personal favoritism. For if a man comes into your assembly with a gold ring and dressed in fine clothes, and there also comes in a poor man in dirty clothes, and you pay special attention to the one who is wearing the fine clothes and say, 'You sit here in a good place,' and you say to the poor man, 'You stand over there or sit down by my footstool,' Have you not made distinctions among yourselves and become judges and eat with evil motives? Listen, my beloved brethren, did not God choose the poor of this world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom, which he promised to those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor man. Is it not the rich who oppress you and personally drag you into court? Do they not blaspheme the fair name by which you have been called? If you show partiality, you are committing sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. Do we automatically lean towards sitting with those that are important or have money? Or does it really matter to us? You know, I used to be involved in the political scene many, many years ago, and I used to go to a lot of fundraising dinners, and you would watch people, you know, they all want to be close to the candidate, whether he's already elected or she's already elected or they're running for election. Because they, in their mind, if they can get close to this individual, if they get elected, then maybe they'll give them some kind of position. And that does happen. I've known people that were put in a certain position. And after Abraham Lincoln was elected as the 16th president of the United States, this was back in the day when the average citizen could just walk into the White House and meet the president. And he would meet hundreds of people every day. And they were, most of them were coming seeking offices, shaking the president's hand and trying to get him to give them some kind of a job or position. Jesus' own disciples were no different. In fact, the mother of James and John was complicit in trying to get her two sons to sit in a high position when Jesus, in her mind, set up an earthly kingdom. And we find that again in the book of Matthew, Matthew 20, verses 20 to 23. Matthew chapter 20, verses 20 to 23. And this is not long before Jesus is crucified that this happens. Matthew 20, verses 20 to 23. And this is when the mother of James and John come to her, or come to Jesus, rather, I'm sorry. And it says, then the mother of her, what do you wish? She said to him, command that in your kingdom these two sons of mine may sit one on your right and one on your left. But Jesus answered and said, you do not know what you are asking for. Are you able to drink the cup that I am about to drink? They said to him, we are able. He said to them, my cup you shall drink, but to sit on my right and on my left, this is not mine to give, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared by my Father. Gathered before Jesus' crucifixion, arguing over who was going to be the greatest. Jesus was trying to be an example to his disciples all through his ministry, and he tried his best to cut through the hundreds of years of prejudice. Now, if you listen to the news media today, you would think that racism and prejudice was invented in the United States, but it was going on long before the United States was even thought about. And in reality, it's been going on ever since sin entered the world, where people are dividing themselves in different people groups. In Jesus' day, you did not associate, if you were Jewish, with a Samaritan. Now, you could do business with the Samaritans, but you didn't associate with them on a social level. And Jesus broke social norms when he was passing through a Samaritan town. He sat down, the Bible tells us, at Jacob's well. And he crossed a cultural line because he started talking to a lady that was there to get water. Now, you never talk to a woman when she wasn't with her husband, for one thing. But also, he was also in this Samaritan village, and you didn't socialize with the Samaritans. And this woman came in the middle of the day because she had a reputation in the community. And she knew that if she came in the evening or the morning when most women came to get, comes by herself, and Jesus knew this, so he sits down there. And the other disciples, they go into the village to get food. Because remember I said you could do business with the Samaritans, but you didn't socialize with them. And so imagine the shock when the disciples come back and they see Jesus sitting with this woman. And they were also shocked to see the whole village come out and hear Jesus teach. And he stayed there for 2 more days. For Jesus, it did not matter the color or the culture of a people group, because to him, they were all his creation and deserved to have the same opportunity for salvation just as much as the Jews. Now, the Jewish temple was even segregated. In fact, if you were a Gentile, you had to stay on a certain side in a certain narrow path, because if you crossed that line, you could be taken out and stoned. Even after Jesus went back to heaven, this mentality stayed with at least one of his disciples, that being Peter. The Bible tells us in the book of Acts, Peter was in the little town of Joppa by the seaside, and he was staying with Simon the tanner. And while he's at this house, Cornelius, a centurion, had a vision. And centurions commanded about 100 men, so he was a minor officer in the Roman army. And in his vision, he's told to visit Peter. And I want you to see this in Acts chapter 10, and that's right after the four Gospels, Acts chapter 10 in the New Testament, and verses 1 through 6. Acts chapter 10, verses 1 through 6. And this is the vision that Cornelius has to go and see Peter. Acts 10, verse 1. Now there was a certain man at Caesarea named Cornelius, a centurion of what was called the Italian cohort, a devout man, and one who feared God with all his household, and gave many alms to the Jewish people, and prayed to God continually. About the ninth hour of the day, he clearly saw in a vision an angel of God who had just come into him and said to him, Cornelius. And fixing his gaze upon him, and being much alarmed, he said, What is it, Lord? And he said to him, Your prayers and alms have ascended as a memorial before God. And now dispatch some men to Joppa, and send for a man named Simon, who is also called Peter. He is staying with a certain tanner named Simon, whose house is by the sea. Now, Peter, while this vision is going on, Peter, who's staying with Simon, he gets hungry, and he goes up on the rooftop. The Bible tells us he starts to go to sleep, but then he goes into a vision himself. And it's a very strange vision. And in verses, we're still in Acts 10, in verses 11 to 16, it tells us that vision. It says, And he beheld the sky opened up, and a certain object, like a great sheet coming down, lowered by four corners to the ground. And there were in it all kinds of four-footed animals, and crawling creatures of the earth, and birds of the air. And a voice came to him, Arise, Peter, kill and eat. But Peter said, By no means, Lord. For I have never eaten anything unholy and unclean. And again a voice came to him a second time. What God has cleansed, no longer consider unholy. And this happened 3 times, and immediately the object was taken up into the sky. Now Peter is baffled by this vision. And many of our Christian brothers and sisters of other denominations use this, say, well, you can eat whatever you want. But it's not pointing to that at all. It's talking about who we associate with. And for Peter and the rest of the Jewish people, you had to be circumcised in order to come into the new Christian faith. Because remember, in the Old Testament, God gave circumcision to the Jewish people as a covenant. And once the Christian church started, these Jewish converts said, unless you are circumcised, you can't come in to the Christian faith. And that's why they had the Council of Jerusalem in Acts chapter 15. And it discussed that whole issue of circumcision, and they determined that you could just come in and give your heart to the Lord. You didn't have to do this physical act. And so you see, many of the Jewish people looked at the Gentiles as unclean. And so God is giving Peter a clear message. You know, what I've called clean, you don't call unclean. In other words, all people are equal. They're on an equal playing field. Cornelius was a Gentile, so Peter thought, along with many of the other Jews, that he was unclean. And when Cornelius gets to Peter's house, where Peter was staying, look at the amazing dialogue between these men in Acts 10, verses 27 to 34. We're still in Acts 10, 27 to 34. And remember, he calls for Peter, and it says, And as he talked with him, he entered and found many people assembled. And he said to them, You yourselves know how unlawful it is for a man who is a Jew to associate with a foreigner or to visit him. And yet God has shown me that I should not call any man unholy or unclean. Peter makes it clear here. So that is why I came without even raising any objection when I was sent for. And so I asked, For what reason you have sent for me? And Cornelius said, 4 days ago to this hour I was praying in my house during the 9th hour, and behold, a man stood before me in shining garments. And he said, Cornelius, your prayer has been heard, and your alms have been remembered before God. Send therefore to Joppa and invite Simon, who is also called Peter, to come to you. He is staying at the house of Simon the tanner by the sea. And so I sent to you immediately, and you have been kind enough to come. Now then, we are all here present before God to hear all that you have been commanded by the Lord. And opening his mouth, Peter said, I most certainly understand now that God is not one to show partiality. Very similar language that what James used that we read earlier. So God is not a respecter of persons. He loves each person equally, and he expects we as Christians to do the same and to witness to all we come in contact with. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean we agree with their lifestyle or become like them. That's not the point. But it does mean that we witness to them. We be kind to them, just as Jesus did with the publicans. He mingled with them and showed them kindness, and by doing this, they were willing to hear what he had to say. The Pharisees had already passed judgment on Jesus, and they didn't want to hear what he had to say. Now, there are many today that take the Pharisaic attitude, and it really pains me to see with what's going on with social media. You know, it's kind of a two-edged sword. And I'll be completely transparent. I got kind of caught up into this a few weeks ago where I argued with a couple of friends of mine about something on social media, and then I apologized. I said, I'm not going to do that anymore, and I haven't, because it's not where we want to go. And I didn't use abusive language or anything like that, but the point is, people are getting so heated in these heated arguments over politics and religion and women's ordination and these different things, even in our own denomination. And that's what Satan wants. He wants a divided church. And that's exactly what is happening with some pockets of our faith. And we don't want to go there. We don't want to be in that group. We want to be united, a united front as Seventh-day Adventist Christians. And we don't want to argue about these things. You know, God is in control, and he'll take care of all these things. And we don't need to be getting in heated arguments. Jesus fought against this behavior all through his ministry, and when it came to those religious leaders that were not any better than anyone else, in fact, in many cases worse, as I pointed out, they were the respecter of persons. You know, they felt that if you were sick, you must have committed a terrible sin, or your parents, and therefore you weren't even allowed in the temple. Or if you were poor, you must have been cursed by God. You did something wrong to get in this condition. The uneducated were not people they wanted to associate with. So you see a pattern here. And if we, as Christians, would eliminate all these different people groups, there'd be nobody left to witness to, you see. And yet the Pharisees were doing just that. We, you know, are going into the Thanksgiving season. And that should be a time when we think of others less fortunate as us and reach out in a spirit of kindness and fellowship as Jesus did. And, you know, the Battlefield Church over here has a food pantry every Wednesday, and we serve anywhere from 14 to 38 families a week. It just depends on the week. And our volunteers over there, they pray with each individual that's open to prayer. And, you know, that's what a lot of these people need more than the physical. They need the spiritual guidance. And the Chattanooga Rescue Mission also feeds and houses hundreds of men and women each year. And one of those individuals came to the mission, and her name was Savannah. Savannah had a bad back, so from the age of 14, she was hooked on opioids and other drugs. And eventually she married and had a child, and her husband said, if you want to save this marriage, you need to get your life straight. So she started going to the Chattanooga Rescue Mission and starting to learn the Bible and how to pray, and she learned how to kick her drug habit through Jesus Christ. Her parents and husband and daughter were at her graduation service. You know, Jesus uses us as vessels to reach others. And there's a text in the Bible, last text we'll look up, Revelation 22, where John talks about the new heaven and the new earth. Revelation 22, 1 and 2. Last book of the Bible and last chapter of the Bible. So that's an easy one to find. Revelation 22, verses 1 and 2. And Revelation 21 and 22 show what the new heaven and the new earth will be like. And in these two verses, and verse 2 is key, it says, and he showed me a river of the water of life, clear as crystal, coming from the throne of God and of the Lamb. In the middle of its street and on either side of the river was the tree of life, bearing 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit every month, and the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. Now, when he talks about the healing of the nation, he's not talking about healing the sick, because there's nobody sick in heaven. But what he's talking about is that we're all going to be united. We're all going to be one in Jesus Christ.
Amen.
There's not going to be any barriers anymore like we have on earth. There's no segregation. We're all going to be one. And in order to be there, we must act like Christ on this earth now that we have the chance to do so. And so let's be friends. Let us pray. Dear Father in heaven, we thank you for these messages that you've given us out of your word, and how there's no room in our hearts, or shouldn't be anyway, for any kind of prejudice. And that as Christians, we can do a lot of good just by being a witness to someone. And Lord, I just ask that you can continue to work on all of our hearts. We thank you for the new souls that have come into the faith here this morning and into the kingdom. And we look forward to seeing you come again in the clouds of glory. But until that time, may we reach out to each and every person we come into contact with. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Let us stand and sing, "Come Christians, join to sing," number 10 in the hymn.